The Good Life in Philadelphia. Luckily for the American Revolution, General William Howe preferred to spend the winter indoors. Howe and the other top British officers sat by blazing fires, playing cards and sipping wine. The British had taken over all the finest houses in town, including Ben Franklin's three-story brick mansion. So Ben's daughter, Sarah, had to find a new place to live. I shall never forget or forgive them for turning me out of my house and my home in the middle of winter, Sarah wrote to her father. At least they wouldn't be able to steal Benz's books. Your library we sent out of town, well packed in boxes, Sarah added. One of the British officers enjoyed the Franklin mansion was a 28-year-old captain named John and Andre. A talented artist, musician, and writer, Andre turned a local warehouse into a theater and put on 13 different plays that winter. In his free time, he visited the homes of young American women, entertaining them by playing flute and reciting poetry. Andre was a frequent guest at the Shippen House, where a beautiful and intelligent 17-year-old named Peggy Shippen lived with her wealthy family. John and Peggy sat in the living room for hours at a time, chatting and drinking tea, sometimes 15 cups per visit. John took Peggy out to dinners and balls and on sleigh rides. We don't know what they were talking about all this time. We do know that they soon started working together on a plan they hoped would destroy the American Revolution. Remember their names. New Hope in the Spring. Back in Valley Forge, life was slowly beginning to improve. Spring brought warmer weather, and wagons full of food began rolling into the American camp. Soldiers set up their little theater and put on plays. George and Martha Washington were always in the attendance. George also relaxed by tossing a ball back and forth with his officers. While Washington was a humble man, he was always proud of his strong right arm. I have several times heard him say, said a friend, that he never met any man who could throw to so great a distance as himself. Another welcome sight at Valley Forge was a short, loud German fellow by the name of Frederick von Steuben. Steuben impressed the Americans by telling them he had been a general in Germany. In fact, he had been a pretty low-ranking officer. He was very valuable to Washington, though, because he had years of experience training soldiers. And since most of the American soldiers had come straight from farms or workshops, they didn't know much about what soldiers were supposed to do. Steuben got up at 3 in the morning each day to begin work. He broke the soldiers into small groups, personally showing each group how to work together in battle. The only problem was he didn't speak much English. When soldiers misunderstood Steuben's commands, he often exploded into red-faced fits of shouting and cursing. First he cursed in German, then in French. Finally he called to his translators, "My dear Walker and my dear Duponce, come and swear for me in English. These fellows won't do what I bid them." The men laughed. Then they tried the exercise again and again and again. Joseph Plum Martin, who was one of the many soldiers trained by Steuben that spring, noticed that the men seemed to have a new energy and confidence. They were eager to get out of Valley Forge and win some battles in 1778. Back in action, in June 1778, the British Army marched out of Philadelphia under the command of General Henry Clinton. General Howe had gotten sick of the war and decided to go home. The British had enjoyed the capital city, but now it was time to get back to the business of attacking Americans. On his way out of town, John Andre stole everything he could carry from Ben Franklin's house, including scientific instruments and a large painting of the famous American. Washington was ready for a fight himself, and on a scorching hot day in late June, the Americans attacked Clinton's army in Monmouth, New Jersey. In spite of the high hopes, this was another disappointing day for George Washington. He had made the mistake of putting a general named Charles Lee in charge of leading the attack. Lee was famous for his strange habits, including wearing filthy clothes and bringing his dogs to fancy dinner parties. When the battle began, Lee decided not to follow Washington's plan. Lee considered himself to be much smarter than Washington. Lee attacked for a little while, then ordered the army to retreat. The soldiers stood around, wondering what to do next. That's when a furious Washington rode up, and this conversation was heard. Washington said, "General Lee, what are you about?" Lee asked. "Sir," Washington answered, "I desire to know, sir, what is the reason for this disorder and confusion?" Lee answered, "The American troops would not stand the British bayonets." Washington replied, "You damned poltron or coward, you never tried them." It was the only time American officers ever heard George Washington swear, so you know he was pretty mad. While Washington tried to organize his army, the temperature soared to 100 degrees, and they did in many battles. Brave women earned the nickname Molly Pitcher by carrying pitchers of water to men on the battlefield. Soldiers needed the water to cool down their blazing cannons, and to drink, of course. One of the most famous Molly Pitchers was Mary Ludwig Hayes. She dodged bullets at Monmouth to deliver water to her husband's cannon crew. When Mary's husband fainted from the heat, she stepped up to his cannon and started blasting it at the British. Joseph Plum Morton saw the whole thing. A cannon shot from the enemy passed directly between her without doing any other damage than carrying away all the lower part of her petticoat. Like so many American Revolution battles, this one had no clear winner, and by the end of 78, the Americans were no closer to winning the Revolution. General Lee, by the way, was kicked out of the Continental Army for disobeying orders. "Oh, that I were a dog, that I might not call my man my brother," he cried. Are you the famous Adams? While Washington tried to think of a way to win the war, John Adams sailed to France. The French had already begun sending soldiers, clothing, and weapons to the United States, but Congress hoped to get more from France. Adams' new assignment: join Ben Franklin in Paris and help persuade the French to send more stuff to the Continental Army. John had wanted Abigail to come along, but he was afraid his ship might be captured by the British, so Abigail stayed home. As always, John and Abigail kept in touch through letters. "To tell you the truth," John wrote soon after arriving in France, "I admire the ladies here. Don't be jealous. They are handsome and very well educated." Unfortunately, the French people quickly ruined John's good mood. They rushed up to him and asked, "Are you the famous Adams?" They knew all about the great revolutionary leader Samuel Adams. John had to say, "No, that's my cousin. I'm John Adams." The French had never heard of anyone by that name. That was just the start of John's trouble. Adams had decided he could save his country some money by moving in with Ben Franklin. And just like the time they shared a bed in the crowded inn, John and Ben began arguing right away. For one thing, Adams complained, Franklin slept too late and spent too much time going to parties. Adams was also annoyed by the constant stream of visitors to their apartments. It seemed like everyone in France wanted to meet Benjamin Franklin. He told Abigail, "By far the greater part were women and children, come to have the honor to see the great Franklin, and to have the pleasure of telling stories about his simplicity, his bald head and scattering stray hairs." The older, wiser Franklin tried to be patient with his roommate. "John Adams is always an honest man, often a wise one," Franklin said, "but sometimes, and in some things, absolutely out of his senses." What Adams didn't realize was that Franklin knew exactly what he was doing. By forming close friendships with important people in Paris, Franklin was able to win favors for the Americans. For example, he succeeded in talking the French into giving a few of their old ships to the new to the Continental Navy. Franklin made sure that one of the ships went to the captain he admired, a man from Scotland named John Paul Jones. The Adventures of John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones has spent the past few years cruising the waters around Britain, capturing one British ship after another. Jones's favorite targets were British trading ships, which were loaded with valuable goods. After capturing these ships, Jones sailed them to nearby ports, sold the goods, split the profits with his crew. Basically, he was a pirate. But this was legal in the 1700s. If you were at war with another country, you were allowed to capture any ship flying their flag, and you called yourself a privateer, not a pirate. By 1778, Jones was the most feared captain in the American Navy. Abigail Adams heard so much about his bold fighting style, she expected him to be a fire-breathing giant. She was surprised to meet the short, just over 5 foot, gentle-looking Jones. Abigail commented, "I should sooner think of wrapping him up in cotton wool and putting him in my pocket than sending him to contend with cannonballs." The British, of course, felt a bit differently about Jones. They were dying to catch him and hang him, and on a warm night in September 1779, with moonlight reflecting off the smooth sea, they got their chance. A British warship named the Serapis spotted an American ship. "What ship is that?" called out Richard Pearson, captain of the Serapis. "Answer immediately, or I shall be under the necessity of firing into you." The next thing Pearson knew a cannonball was flying towards his ship. Pearson had run into the Bonhomme Richard. Under the command of John Paul Jones, floating so close that they sometimes crashed together, the two ships battered each other with cannonballs, guns, and grenades. Both crews had to stop fighting every few minutes to put out fires on their wooden ships. Seeing that the Bonhomme Richard was badly damaged, Captain Pearson asked John Paul Jones if he was ready to surrender. Jones barked back on the best lines in American history. Jones barked back, "I have not yet begun to fight." The fighting continued for nearly 4 hours, and the Bonhomme Richard was soon blasted so full of holes that the British cannonballs sailed in one side of the ship and out the other without hitting anything. Then Jones saw one of his sailors, William Hamilton, do something amazing. This brave man, on his own accord, seized a lighted match and a basket of grenades. Jones said. Hamilton climbed up the mast and started tossing grenades down onto the deck of the British ship. One of these grenades landed in a pile of gunpowder and the Serapis, sparking a massive explosion. "It was awful," reported British officer Francis Heddert. "Some 20 of our men were fairly blown to pieces. There were other men who were stripped naked, with nothing on but the collars of their shirts and wristbands. The British pulled down their flag, the signal for surrender." Jones had won, though the ship was badly damaged. It sank 2 days later. And Jones himself was shaken by his violent victory. "A person must have been an eyewitness," he said, "to form a just idea of the tremendous scene of carnage, wreck, and ruin that everywhere appeared." Benedict Arnold in love. Now we return to the never-boring Benedict Arnold. Nearly a year after the Battle of Saratoga, Arnold had still not recovered from his wounds. Splinters from his shattered bone often poked into the nerves in his left leg, causing unbearable pain. Clearly, Arnold was not well enough to charge around the battlefield on horseback, so Washington gave him the fairly easy job of protecting Philadelphia. Arnold had not been in town long before he met and fell in love with, guess who? Young Peggy Shippen. Peggy easily accomplished something British guns had not. She made the great general nervous. Arnold wrote, "20 times have I taken up my pen to write to you, and as often as my trembling hand refused to obey the dictates of my heart." Arnold got over his fears, though, and soon he won Peggy's heart. They were married in April 1779. He was 39, she was 19. You might think Benedict Arnold would finally be happy. Aside from the pain in his leg, though, he was still bitter about seeing Horatio Gates take credit for his victory at Saratoga. Arnold was the kind of guy who always felt people didn't appreciate him enough. Also, Arnold was broke. He had recently borrowed a fortune to buy Peggy a huge house, and he had no hope of paying back the loan. Just a month after his marriage, Benedict Arnold decided to see how much the British would pay him to change sides in the war. Peggy, a loyalist at heart, played a key role in Benedict Arnold's secret plan. She knew that he would need to begin sending messages to the British, so she helped him contact her good friend John Andre. Andre was now an assistant to General Clinton, in a perfect position to help with the plot. In a long series of coded letters written in invisible ink, the three started working out their new strategy. Arnold's fiendish plan. In the summer of 1780, Benedict Arnold took over command of West Point, an American fort on the Hudson River in New York. Control of West Point was so important, Washington called it the key to America. It was also the key to Arnold's plan. Here's how it was supposed to work. Arnold and Andre would agree on a time for the British to attack West Point. Arnold would make sure to have his soldiers in all the wrong places, and the British would capture the fort easily. And there was more. George Washington was coming to inspect West Point in September. If the British timed their attack just right, they could grab George Washington too. In exchange, Arnold was to be paid a cool £20,000 and made a general in the British Army. One of the most amazing things about Benedict Arnold's plot is just how close it came to actually working. Imagine how different our history would be if Washington had been taken to Britain and hanged. Arnold made a critical mistake, though. He insisted on meeting Andre face to face so the men could talk out the last minute details of their plan. At about 2 in the morning on September 22nd, Andre rowed a small boat to a dark spot on the shore of the Hudson River. Arnold was waiting for him. Andre is captured. Arnold and Andre talked until sunrise. Arnold wrote out plans showing just how the British should attack West Point. Andre put the papers in his boot, got on a horse, and rode south towards New York City, which the British still controlled. There he would meet with General Clinton, and then the British attack could begin. One big problem: the woods north of New York City were dangerous no man's land, an area in between British and American territory, filled with gangs of violent bandits. Some gangs were pro-American, some pro-British, but mostly they just liked to steal people's money. So Andre rode through these woods. 3 men jumped out from behind a tree and grabbed his horse. Andre had a split second to guess which side these guys were on. He guessed wrong. Andre, I am glad to see you. I am an officer in the British service. Bandit, get down. We are Americans. Struggling to keep his cool, Andre instantly changed his story. He tried to frighten the thieves by saying he was actually an American on urgent business for General Arnold. Gentlemen, you had best let me go, or you will bring yourselves in trouble, for by stopping me, you will detain the general's business. But these guys just wanted to know one thing: where is your money? Gentlemen, I have none about me, Andre explained. The men pulled Andre off the road and searched him, and Andre really didn't have much money on him. But he did have something very strange stuffed into his boot. The thieves started reading the papers. And Arnold escapes. Back at West Point, Arnold was eating breakfast at his headquarters when a messenger dashed in and handed over a urgent note. Arnold tore it open and read. A British spy was just captured with maps of West Point in his boot. Arnold leapt up from the table, ran upstairs as fast as his bad leg would carry him, and told Peggy the terrible news. She was in bed with their newborn son, Edward. Then he hobbled outside, raced his horse down the river, hopped on a boat, and started rowing south. This was the last time anyone saw Benedict Arnold in an American uniform. At that very moment, George Washington and his staff were approaching Arnold's headquarters. The men were all looking forward to seeing the famously beautiful Peggy. You young men are in love with Miss Arnold, Washington teased his officers, but as the boat approached Arnold's house, it started to seem like something wasn't right. Arnold should have fired a few cannons as a salute to the commander-in-chief, but the cannons were silent. The impropriety of his conduct when he knew I was to be there struck me very forcibly, Washington later said, but I had not the least idea of the real cause. Just minutes later, he learned the real cause. As Washington was sitting down to lunch in Arnold's house, another messenger ran in and handed over the papers found in John Andre's boot. There were maps and plans for attacking West Point, all in Benedict Arnold's handwriting. Washington sat quietly for a moment, holding the papers and shaking hands. He finally looked up at General Henry Knox and said, Arnold has betrayed me. Whom can we trust now? Washington soon shook off the shock and went to work. He set the soldiers at West Point ready for a British attack, though none came. Then he put John Andre on trial, found him guilty of being a spy, and hanged him. Washington could much rather have hanged Arnold, but Arnold was beyond his reach. Safe in British headquarters in New York City. Peggy, meanwhile, managed to save her skin with a brilliant bit of acting. When Washington came to her room, Peggy threw a hysterical fit, shouting over and over, "This is not General Washington. This is the man who is going to kill my child." She was so shocked by her husband's treason, it seemed, that she had lost her senses. Washington was convinced that she had nothing to do with the plot. Peggy later joined her husband in New York.